We discuss the three biggest ADP movers at the wide receiver position in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also read her at Yahoo Fantasy. On today's show, we are discussing the three wide receivers who saw the biggest change in their average draft position over the last 30 days. And Kate, let's start with our guy, Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers, who has seen a pretty significant jump in his ADP up from 68th overall to 55 in just the last 30 days. Can you explain this sudden rise in his ADP?
What's super interesting is we were just talking about Justin Herbert as a massive follower on our quarterback movers episode just a couple of days ago. So to see the inverse correlation between Herbert and his now top receiver is pretty interesting. But I gotta say, I think a big part of this ADP movement is the fact that reports about Ladd McConkey, his initial involvement in the offense, his grasp of the offense, all things seem like systems are go for Ladd McConkey to be the top receiving option in this offense. I think day one, Ladd McConkey comes into this team and is the best wide receiver in the room. He was known for his route running, never had a monster season at Georgia, never topped, 900 receiving yards even. Like, this was not a guy whose like stat line is going to wow you, but he brings a lot of, I think, skill with him that he didn't get to show off necessarily at Georgia because that's not the way the offense worked, right? He was effectively working as this team's wide receiver too. Brock Bowers was the preferred receiving option. And guess what? He's bigger, he's got speed, he's got yards after the catch ability. Like, you understand why they were utilizing Brock Bowers in the way that they were. Ladd McConkey also dealt with some health issues in his final season with Georgia. I think there are a lot, like, you look at the box score and you have to approach it with some sort of like sense of nuance because there's a lot more to why Ladd McConkey didn't break out. I think people are looking at the tape. They're looking at the opportunity with a really, really good quarterback throwing him the ball, and they're just putting two and two together.
I think it's also the stream of negative news that's also come out about Quentin Johnson, how he's been running with the second team, and he might be like the backup slot to Ladd McConkey. And then you look at the tight end position, and there's just really nothing there outside of blockers, right? It's not hard to envision that Ladd McConkey gets the most targets out of this wide receiver class outside of maybe Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors. Like, he's just locked and loaded into a really big role. And the price is palatable. I mean, he's getting more expensive, but it's not overly expensive. He's just wide receiver 33, ahead of Keon Coleman, Jaden Reed, Amari Cooper. But now he's not getting into that next tier where you're having to draft him over, let's say, like Devontae Adams or George Pickens or Tank Dell. He's just at a very palatable price right now. And I think the more positive buzz we get about Ladd and the more negative buzz that we get about the rest of the receivers in Los Angeles are only going to keep this ADP going up.
Yeah, I do think that this is a really interesting time in terms of his value. Like you said, you don't necessarily have to roll the dice by passing on, another one of these guys that, like, you already know what you're getting with, right? Like, he is a guy that you can still kind of speculate about in terms of his total upside, but you don't necessarily have to gamble. Like I think back to Quentin Johnston, like last year. There are a lot of people that went all in on sort of the projection and drafted Quentin Johnston
Mhm.
far, far, far too high, passing up on some kind of known commodities. Like we're not there yet with Ladd McConkey. And I think people maybe are particularly cautious because a wide receiver on the same team last year tanked so hard. But like I think this is still the time where like you can probably trade for Ladd McConkey. You can and not necessarily have to give up a king's ransom to do so because I think yeah, people are just still a little bit cautious, but
But to me, they couldn't be
yeah.
more different. Like Quentin Johnson coming out of TCU was a big physical receiver with good athleticism who was a project, right? Like if they needed to teach him how to run routes, how to beat press coverage, the first Chargers staff tried to play him as an outside X receiver, and that was just never going to be his game. Like he was just never going to be that outside vertical guy. He needs to be a power slot. But unfortunately, in a Jim Harbaugh offense, there's just not really a role for a power slot. Like they don't really use that, right? Where Ladd McConkey is somebody who coming out of Georgia, great route runner, has played multiple years, went to the Senior Bowl, dominated the Senior Bowl, can run every route. Now he might not have the upside, like if you're talking about like if both players reach their absolute peak, Quentin Johnson's upside is higher, but Ladd I think can come in and be a productive player right away. To me, they couldn't be any more different. So I am expecting Ladd McConkey to come in and produce solid numbers right away, unlike Quentin Johnston.
Yeah, I think the pathway and again, just the archetype of receiver paints a much clearer picture for how you're going to utilize Ladd McConkey as opposed to a Quentin Johnston that as you noted, I don't really think they knew what to do with him.
No.
They were like, okay, we know the ceiling is high. We've seen the splash plays, but there's still a lot of navigating you have to do to get him to the point where he can produce on an every down basis. And
Yes.
I just never thought they necessarily found that pathway. And as you mentioned, I don't know that we are going to see like I would love to see Quentin Johnston get traded to another team, get a fresh start because I do think there were a lot of traits there that you're going to like that could translate to another offense. He needs to
He
take a beat, but
the problem is he's falling in this Treylon Burks role where it's like, what do you do with this receiver, and how many teams are going to be able to utilize this guy, or how many teams don't have a receiver already in that role? I mean, you're talking about maybe one or two teams in the entire NFL. That's why it's really hard to find a good landing spot for either of those players.
and that's why drafting them is a
It's
lot
risky.
riskier, like,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you have to not just have a role for them in the offense, like, you need an offensive coordinator that, A, can create that role for them and then also know how to utilize it to maximize their skill sets, but
Correct.
Ladd McConkey is not that guy. Ladd McConkey is a guy who's, I think skill set you could translate to any NFL offense, and he'd be perfectly fine. He is an
I agree.
excellent route runner. I think can play all three levels of the field. You can use him in the short game. You can use him deep. Like he's got just such a safe skill set that I'm all in on Ladd McConkey. We loved him coming out of
Yep.
Georgia in this draft class. You love the you know draft capital, right? Like he fell out of the first round, but he was drafted at the very top of the second, basically a first round pick. I I think you couldn't ask for much more in terms of safe floor. And I think the upside's still high enough
I would
with a
agree.
guy like Ladd McConkey that like you're not going to turn your nose at it.
I mean, again, he's being drafted as wide receiver 33, and he's 22 years old. Like, we don't need him to be, you don't need him to be a wide receiver one for him to return value. Like, if he ends up being a high end wide receiver 3 over the next couple of years, boom, you got your draft pick back. All right, okay, let's talk about another receiver who has seen a very significant rise in his ADP. Let's discuss Carolina Panthers wide receiver. That feels new. Diontae Johnson next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier than ever before. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer that it gets to first pitch. And with killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, and theater events near you. Save even more with exclusive in app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. And get this, you can save even more when you choose a section and let Gametime choose your exact seats. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that unnecessary screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Kate, let's discuss Diontae Johnson, the Carolina Panthers' new receiver, who has seen his ADP go from 77th to 64th over the last 30 days. He's up quite a bit in Dynasty leagues, up to wide receiver 38. Can you explain this rise for him?
I gotta say, I am pleasantly surprised with this rise because Diontae Johnson is a guy that I thought was kind of undervalued. And maybe I'm biased. I have my terrible towel sitting just behind me. But I've watched a lot of Diontae Johnson, and I do think that generally just kind of an underrated football player. He's not he's a perfect player. He's dealt with like some drop issues. He's not always had like the most uh, I don't know what to say.
He
Like
needs to figure out sometimes which way to run. I mean,
yeah,
goes
like
backwards.
there are not perfect plays all the time with Deontay Johnson. Like sometimes the decision making after the catch will drive you a little bit bonkers, but he actually had a pretty underrated season this year in terms of his total like upside and production. Like he actually had a lot of, just solid plays, dealt with some health issues as well, which was kind of a underrated aspect of his entire trajectory. But this was actually one of his best seasons in terms of just overall play and efficiency. Like we saw pretty much everything from yards per route run, yards per reception, posted a career year there. Um, didn't have his most efficient year, only 59.8% of targets were caught. Again, the drops kind of
Although
rough.
that might be a more of a quarterback stat than a Deontay
That's
stat.
fair, especially in Pittsburgh. But again, a career year in terms of 1.9 yards per route run, a career second best in his career yards after the catch per reception. And that was despite a lot of ups and downs. Like I think that people are seeing Diontae Johnson for the upside. We already know he can, handle being a team's number one target. I think the addition of Xavier Legette, who has a much different kind of skill set. He's not, the same type of route runner that Diontae Johnson is, but he can be this big physical guy on the outside where Diontae Johnson can play more of this finesse role. Like, I think people are seeing that value and what could be for this Carolina Panthers offense with Dave Canales at head coach.
I think right now people are just looking at Diontae Johnson as like a sneaky guy to get 150 targets, right? And you're not having to pay top 35 wide receiver prices for him. Again, in fact, he's being drafted as wide receiver 38. And when you get to these later stages of your dynasty startup, you're just looking for guys that can eat up targets and, be wide receiver threes that with some upside. and that's Diontae Johnson, 28 years old, a little older, but that's not super old for a wide receiver. You could still project him to have at least 2 to 3 quality years left. And they kind of have to throw the ball a lot. I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball particularly well. I think the defense is going to be a problem. And I think Diontae is just going to gobble up so many targets because he gets open. He can play on the outside. He can play in the slot. I get it. Now, I'm not the biggest Diontae Johnson fan for some of the reasons that you outlined. Like, I don't know if he's the most reliable player game in and game out. But to me, he is so clearly the best player on this offense. Why not give him as many touches as possible? Why not let him try to help you run the offense at an adequate level? I just see Bryce Young targeting him over and over and again. And when you get in that range of the draft and it's Chris Godwin or Diontae Johnson, I'd rather just take Diontae Johnson.
Yeah, all of that is pretty fair. And I think like what I'm projecting for Diontae Johnson is kind of this safety blanket role for Bryce Young. Like I think he's going to be this guy that if things go poorly, he's not a 50-50 guy by any means, but I do think he's going to be a bit of a safety blanket and you know, a guy that you can utilize within the offense to get your quarterback in rhythm, which Bryce Young desperately needs. Like I think they're going to really make a concerted effort to get the ball into Diontae Johnson's hands, you know, early and often in games. And yeah, like you mentioned the age. I mean, we see I feel like age isn't even a conversation anymore for wide receivers. Like unless until we're getting to like age 30, and then we can start to have that conversation, especially if you're not like an elite wide receiver. But like where he's at right now, I mean, let's go.
Yeah, I'm with you. I just think it's a very appropriate price on it for a receiver that's going to, again, I keep saying this over and over, that's going to get a million targets, right? And maybe, Kate, there's also a chance that we're not discussing. Maybe he's just better outside of Pittsburgh, right? I mean, the spotlight in Pittsburgh was really bright on Diontae. Maybe on a team that's not going to be as competitive, maybe he just feels a little bit more comfortable and he's a better overall player. So, again, at that price of wide receiver 38, I'm buying Diontae Johnson. But I want to ask, go ahead.
There's one other thing that I want to bring up with Diontae Johnson in terms of his dynasty value that I find a little bit intriguing. He's going to be a free agent in 2025.
Yeah.
Like if he has a big year with the Carolina Panthers, he could be walking his way into some money. And again, with the free agent market, who knows like the possibilities are kind of endless. Maybe he just signs an extension with the Carolina Panthers. Like maybe, but I do think the fact that he is set to be a free agent and in a contract year, that's kind of appealing because maybe
it's a fair point.
Maybe he's going to be positioned on this offense that we're not projecting as you know, an overly competitive one here for this year. But if he hits the free agent market, he might have his choice of a lot of interesting landing spots.
All right, let's talk about a receiver who has seen a decrease in their ADP after switching teams. Let's discuss Stefon Diggs next. This episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. It's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're going to be burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. On tomorrow's show, we're going to be taking a look at some tight ends that have seen the biggest ADP rises and falls over the last 30 days. So make sure you guys tune in for that. But Kate, let's finish up here with Stefon Diggs, who has seen his ADP go from 56 overall down to 67th. He is currently being drafted as wide receiver 40 behind our guy Diontae Johnson, a wide receiver 38. Is this just because there's so many different mouths to feed in Houston?
I think there are a lot of things contributing to Stefon Diggs's dig in ADP.
Oh,
Like,
nice. Great job.
let's talk about like the most obvious, right? Stefon Diggs is an aging wide receiver, and I just mentioned in last segment that I'll wait until like we hit the age 30 season, right? He's going to turn 31 this year. Has the elite bill, so I'm not going to say that he's not elite, and he's one of these cohorts that I will generally worry less about when they hit that 30-year mark, but it's a real conversation that needs to be had. He is in a contract year, which is kind of interesting, but I think what people are cooling on is the fact that he had a fairly, I'm not going to say like disastrous second half of the season, but Stefon Diggs in, weeks 1 through 6 was a league winning wide receiver.
Mhm.
In the second half of last year, despite the fact that like, he was the focal point of that offense, he took a step back. He was earning fewer targets per game, 7.8 targets per game. Is kitty litter when you're talking about the fact that he had, 10 plus targets in all but 2 of the first 8 weeks of the season. Like he did. He regressed in this offense and regressed in terms of his overall efficiency in the second half. This is the second year in a row that he's done that, by the way. Um, how will he fit into the Houston Texans offense? I don't know. This is kind of the third, this is the third team for Stefon Diggs. And both instances, we've heard grumblings of just like dissatisfaction. Like, I feel like all of these are aspects of Stefon Diggs and his current price in Dynasty that have fantasy managers a little skittish.
Yeah, I'm kind of out on Stephon Diggs this year. First of all, because I think Tank Dell is a better player, and I think Nico Collins is a significantly different type of player than Diggs. Right, he's the guy that can go up and make plays in the air. He's kind of has this long speed, big athlete. I think Diggs is going to be the guy that's third in the pecking order in targets, and it's just going to be so inconsistent week to week. And unlike the other two, there's just a lot of instability there, right? Like Nico Collins just signed a long-term deal. Tank Dell is on the second year of his rookie contract. We don't know what's going to happen to Stefon Diggs. I think it's very likely that he's on a new team in 2025. I think there's also a chance, Kate, that he gets traded at the deadline, right? Like there's just another team that wants a receiver, and the Texans feel like, hey, we've got our two guys. We want to, figure out maybe John Mechie ends up taking the third receiver role because he's a better blocker. I just don't know what there's so many different outcomes that could happen with Stefon Diggs that I just don't want to be part of it right now. And then the other part of it, you mentioned he was a league winner in the first 6 weeks of the season. And then he was atrocious the rest of the way, including in the playoffs. I mean, he was invisible in the Pittsburgh game. He had the massive drop in the Kansas City playoff game. The Bills basically, their offense got better the less they used him down the stretch. And I think that's pretty telling. They got better when they started targeting Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, and James Cook more in the passing game. I don't want to say Stefon Diggs is washed because I don't think that's true. But I think the days of him being like a number one receiver are certainly over. And I do wonder, like, is he just going to fall to third on in the pecking order in Houston? If that's the case, he's not going to be somebody that you want to start in any week in fantasy leagues.
And Stefon Diggs, I don't think is going to be a guy that would handle that particularly well. Something else that I think is kind of telling about the Stefon Diggs situation that we probably haven't talked enough about in terms of like the context of how he left Buffalo, but like the Buffalo Bills took on $31 million in dead cap this year to get rid of Stefon Diggs.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that says something to me.
It's telling.
Mm.
I know.
I hate it. I hate it because, like, from a talent perspective, Stefon Diggs is one of the best wide receivers in the league. But, like, if we're calling 2024 kind of a wash, right? Because there's going to be a ton of competition for targets. There's Nico Collins, Stefon Diggs. You have Joe Mixon, who might be
Mhm.
involved in the passing game. You have Dalton Schultz, who he's
Capable
back
tight end.
again with a long-term deal. Like, there are so many mouths to feed that, like, if we're calling 2024 kind of a wash, then he's going to be 31 next year,
31.
going into
Yep.
his age 32 season. Like, is it going to
13
get
in 3
better?
years likely. Yep.
Like,
Yep. I'm out. I'm out.
yeah,
Now, again, if the price continues to drop and we see him go from wide receiver 40 down to wide receiver 50, which there's not that big of a drop in ADP, by the way. He's being drafted as the 67th overall player. If it's down, in the 87 range, like where Xavier Legette and Jamison Williams are being drafted, I think that's a different conversation. But right now, am I taking him over Christian Kirk? Absolutely not. I'd just rather have Christian Kirk. Am I taking Diontae Johnson over Stefon Diggs? Absolutely. So there is a point where he could become a value. I just don't think we're there yet.
and this is, I think, one of the big takeaways when you're looking at a player, you know, in terms of real life NFL value versus their fantasy value. Stefon Diggs is just going to be a mismatch that we're going to have to live with because I don't
Yes,
see necessarily a pathway for things to get much better much quickly.
I agree.
Much
All right, that
quickly?
is it. Quicker, right?
Yeah.
It's all right. Fine. It's I like it much quicker. All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen every single day. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. You can follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. You can also read her at Yahoo Fantasy. I am at Marcus _Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.